A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse, he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ensley Review of Books. I'm Jake Brookins. Each episode, we talk about at least arguably speculative fiction, and we ask writers, scholars, and critics to tell us what they think about it. Today, we are reading Melissa Scott's novel Burning Bright, and I am so excited to welcome Dr. Ursula Whitcher onto the show to talk about it. Ursula is a writer, mathematician, and poet. She has short fiction and poetry in Analog, Frivolous, The Deadlands, and more. Her reviews and essays have appeared in such illustrious venues as the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association blog and the Ensley Review of Books. Her extremely good mosaic novel, North Continent Ribbon, came out last year from Neon Hemlock. Ursula, thanks so much for joining. Thanks for suggesting this book. How are you?
I'm good. It's great to be here. I've got a cat curled up on my lap who is excited to join this podcast. We'll see if he contributes some chirps or not. And it's a holiday weekend, so it's nice to have a little bit of time to catch up on the 16 different things that I promised to write.
Oh my gosh, big same, as they say. I'm still recovering from Worldcon travels because my day job piled up and my non-day job, which is all the editing and reviewing and stuff I do, piled up. So everyone listening to this, hopefully by the time this episode releases, I will have responded to your email. But if I haven't, I swear to you, I will respond to your email. I just haven't got there yet. Before we jump into this, what else have you been reading? Anything good?
Yeah, so I just finished Interprominent Das's book, The Last Dragoners of Balbazar, which is just really, really gorgeous. And so that was a huge pleasure. And I got invited to be part of the playtest team for a game that's based on Fonda Lee's Green Bones books.
Ooh, cool.
Yeah, so James Mendes Hodis is working with Fonda Lee to turn it into a role-playing game setting, and I've just begun reading those, and it's really sort of fascinating to revisit that world and to think about it from the different perspective of how would you try to put a game inside it.
Yeah, that seems I don't know. That seems very amenable to a game adaptation. That's really fun. That's cool. I'm glad you called out Dragoners, The Last Dragoners too, because that's just such a fun book. I really
It's
love
so
that.
beautiful.
Yeah. I feel like I've mentioned this on the podcast before. I'm not sure. Do you happen to know Bruce Covell, the children's writer? Aliens Ate My Homework.
I think I saw those, but I was somehow like, just slightly the wrong age to actually
Oh,
read
okay.
them as a
Yeah.
child.
He has this book from his Magic Shop series called Jeremy Thatcher Dragon Hatcher, which I read when I was, I don't know, 9 or 10 or something like that. But it's just about this little kid who develops this connection to a dragon, and it's very not silly. It has this sort of strange, wistful connection to this magical thing that Last Dragoners was really firing for me. Such a good book. I'm trying to think what else I've been reading. I've been reading a lot, but they're not sticking in my brain. I'm incredibly enjoying Thomas Ha's collection that's coming out here, Uncertain Suns.
Oh, amazing.
I can't give big up enough to that collection. Really, really good. I keep wanting to call it Unfortunate Sons, which is what the Creedence song is actually about. So I keep catching myself every time I tell people to read it. But it's Uncertain Sons, and yeah, you should check it out. Really, really good. All right, but enough of that. Let's talk about today's book. So today we are reading Burning Bright by Melissa Scott. This was published in 1993 by Tor Books. It is a science fiction story about interstellar politics and online role-playing games colliding. I'd say it's cyberpunk, or at least very cyberpunk adjacent. So when a starship pilot who is also an avid gamer, actually more of a game session designer, lands on the titular planet of Burning Bright, she finds herself swept up in a complicated plot between different human and non-human factions. Scott is a prolific author, and I think when you talk about this, I think is one of those slightly cult figures. She's not talked about too much generally, but she's really beloved by the people who get what she's doing. She won the Campbell Award for Best New Writer all the way back in 1986. Her most recent book, an entry in her Astrayant series, came out this year. And this book, Burning Bright, was a finalist for the Lambda Award, and Scott has won the Lambda for 4 other novels, 2 with co-authors. I had read Trouble and Her Friends, but other than that, I wasn't super familiar with Scott. I know people who really like a lot of her work, so this was a great excuse to come back to this book. Why did you pick this? We were talking about different things we could discuss, and this was on your list, and wound up being the one we narrowed it down to. Why was this in your mind to talk about?
Sure. So for me, this is a book that was really formative. I bought it as a young teenager in a little bookstore that I don't think exists anymore, grabbing it out of the paperback racks with my allowance money. And it was something that for me really expanded sort of my ideas of about what science fiction could be and what stories you could tell. And that means that I was really fascinated to come back to it as an adult. It's a book that I've reread a few times over the years, and it's always fun when you have a long history with a book like that to see what the things are that you notice this time around.
Yeah, what jumped out at you coming back to it this time?
This time I'm much more alert to the structure of the book.
Mm.
This is something that I think as a writer I've become more interested in long form plot. And so this time around I'm really aware of the ways that Scott is structuring what she's doing. And particularly the way that there's a sort of running visual metaphor of like something repeating of a loop that changes that you see all kinds of different ways through the book. There's a couple characters who are making art items that they call story eggs, where you have this sort of beautiful physical object with a porthole that you can peer into it and you see just like a little loop of a bigger scene repeating and repeating. And I think she's using that idea of the loop that comes back again and again and maybe shifts a little as a way of saying sort of like, here is the way this entire story moves.
No, totally. That 100% makes sense. So this is my first time reading it. My kind of like big impressions of it, like off the cuff, were one that it took me a bit to get enough of the pieces in my head for it to kind of pick up steam. Like it takes quite a while to see kind of like what the larger structure is. But once that in place, like the back maybe like third or so of this really rips along. Like it goes from this kind of like world building, sketching out, getting to know. There's maybe like, I don't know, maybe like 4, 5, 6 kind of main characters you get to know. And just doing a lot of time just sort of like sitting with them, not really knowing what the big picture is. And then all of a sudden everything kind of shifts into focus. And it's like this, it basically has like thriller energy towards the back end and just everything starts moving really quickly. I was thinking about that and I was thinking about how much this, again, reading this for the first time, really feels like 2 entirely separate books that shouldn't work together, and yet they do, because the very science fictiony political side of it is one story, with these factions maneuvering and these smuggling and trade laws, and right there's like a whole alien diplomacy angle to this, and then you have these people who are really all about the game, like capital G game. They do overlap, but it's interesting because you have all these people who are really into the political scene. They don't really know or care about the game except as this sort of, it's a way to keep people busy, or it's like a way to like know that someone, oh, they're going to be at such and such a place playing this game.
Right. And there are all these conversations about if you're good at scheming within the game, does that actually make you effective as a political player? Or are you somehow off? Like, are there skills that you would need to do real world politics that don't carry over from whatever your expertise is within this game?
Yeah, totally. So it's like it feels like these two things, and they sort of overlap, but it I really like that the idea of like looping and being concerned with sort of like spirals and whether or not you can break from them as like a thing in this, because it feels like they're all these little separate, well, like little story eggs, right? That are kind of like up against each other here, and like sometimes they connect and sometimes they don't. One of the things thematically that was really jumping out at me was so ransom, how do we say this?
I just say ransom.
I'm going to say Ransom, which, by the way, so there's this character in the book called Ransom who was formerly like this really well-known hotshot gamer who's like kind of retired, semi-retired, and he gets pulled back into stuff. Because his name is Ransom and because it is set on a water world, I couldn't help but think of C.S. Lewis's Paralandra at several points through this. I don't know if I have any like rich connections to pull between that, but I kept thinking of that. I was really intrigued by how, I don't want to say dismissive, but he's really like done with the game, right? And he thinks that gaming is kind of like a lesser art that's like sort of like a distraction and like keeping artistic talents away from doing something more serious.
Yeah.
which I think is interesting. And not everyone agrees with him. And then again, we got to talk about pronunciation. So Quinn Leo, I'm gonna say
Sure, let's
Leo.
go with
All
it.
right, let's go Leo. Who's the sort of like main protagonist, who's this pilot, who's also a very good game designer. She is really fascinated by endings, and has been told by people like too invested in endings. And that theme, I really dug that, where there's this thing that people love a lot, but maybe it's gone on too long. And
Yeah.
like the next people coming in trying to figure out how to end it, I dug that. I was really thinking about that a lot.
Yeah, something I really enjoy reading this book now is that we've seen the rise of like actual play podcasts. And so, in some ways, the game that's envisioned is really different from the role-playing games that you would have played like in the 90s, because in the 90s, there wasn't a kind of like set of public figures that you could see playing a long campaign and get invested in. And now that happens. And you can imagine that somebody could have like a really big actual play and feel in some way stuck in it or try to break out of it or be trying to see if they could like sort of seed other people's games with the ideas from their actual play. And so
Hmm.
that's kind of a fun little thing where our culture has actually gotten closer to this book over the years.
It's really fascinating. I mean, I always find it fascinating to come back to 80s and 90s cyberpunk and think about kind of like how they're thinking about various tech things that have changed, in the intervening years.
Yeah.
And this one's super fascinating because this is not like totally before the internet or before like the kind of online gaming we think about now, but it is very early, right?
Right.
So I was like checking myself. I was like, okay, this is 93. So I was going and looking through, and so the Dragonlance novelization started in 84. So like we've been having some like Dungeons and Dragons RPG kind of style novelization. That's been going for a bit. The first Neverwinter Nights online game is 91. So it's like barely out. This is doing so many things with both anticipating what's going to happen as like online gaming develops in different ways, but it's also doing all these like inventive things that kind of go in different directions that we haven't quite followed, which I love that.
Yeah, I have a feeling that like Commedia dell'arte is another big influence on the way that Scott envisions the game.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think I have in my notes here just like how deep we want to go into like how much Venice slash maybe New Orleans and like Carnival and like how much that's impacting it because it's a lot.
Yeah.
The recurring idea of masking and like taking role playing like kind of like as a serious thing threads through both like the quote unquote real world that they're in and the game that they're playing.
I'm also interested in how interested Scott is in visual storytelling. A lot of the things that Quinn Leo is doing when she's preparing a game is figuring out like how to pick the right image that will give the sense of really being in this sort of more classic space opera world that she's telling the story within.
That totally makes sense, and it is fascinating how much this because again this is 93 and this story yeah fits within a certain kind of space opera that I think if you're familiar with like that era of science fiction you can very easily kind of fill in some of the blanks in your head, but it's very much carved off from it and doing its own thing, right? Like the opening chapter is the spaceship, right? And it's sort of getting like this slight glimpses of how these ships work that have some kind of sails, and then after that, we're just all on the planet, and a huge chunk of it is in the game and in designing the game, in like the actual like tech that Leo is carrying around, right, and like figuring out how to like move images around. They even like she has a brief conversation with Ransom about like the different types of memory they're using, like linear memory versus other kinds.
Yeah.
But I think you're totally right about the I don't know the interest it has in storytelling generally and in specifically in visual storytelling and working with this sort of like maybe iconography is the right way to say it and trying to like build these sets of images that can be reused in rich ways.
I went back and reread Trouble and Her Friends as well, which I hadn't revisited in a long, long time. And Scott notes in her introduction that she wrote Trouble and Her Friends as in some ways a tribute to like old-fashioned movie westerns. So there's a very clear standoff at the end of that book. And it is a movie standoff. It's something that's happening in one of these online cyberpunk virtual worlds. And a lot of the force of it within the story is the fact that everyone can see this happening and everyone can see it going down. And so it's that kind of interaction between something that's staged and viewed by a ton of viewers and sort of like real world politics that I think is a theme Scott really returns to often.
I love the scenes here, like in the gaming sessions, with like I don't know, just the idea of like these sort of niche celebrities and everyone like being like, oh, like did you hear like Ambidexter's back in the game and like running down to like see it, and of course it's online, but people still are physically gathering at this space to watch it. Yeah, it was really interesting.
Right. And one of the things that it does in looping is you see different in-game characters being played by different people. And so there are slightly different shifts in interpretation and in action that are coming from like who is interpreting this character in this vignette that you're seeing.
Yeah, it is wild how given like this comes out like, after like video games have been going for a bit, and it does have this very strong visual component, but the game itself is very clearly about role playing, right? It's not about
Right.
whiz bang upgrading your laser gun. It's about how do you play this role and how different human players bring different things to the characters. And yeah, we get what is it? Ixion's wheel is the scenario they're playing, and we get that 3 times, 4 times, but like seeing like the same like little sequence at the end, like with different people in different roles, like several times.
Right. Like they're trying to break off of a prison planet and they're trying to bring enough people along that it will actually be more than just one episode, that it will somehow shift the broader politics.
Yeah, I mean that's just to come back to kind of like my hobby horse about the endings thing. That was let's see, where is this? It says about the only convention that was held sacrosanct by every gamer was that no scenario could be allowed to tip the balance between rebellion and Imperium, which are the two forces fighting. To change that would be to change the game itself. And then a little bit later, when Ransom is kind of like thinking about Leo's skill, which he thinks is very high, and kind of wanting her to do other things, he thinks, how could she stand to stay confined, stuck inside the boundaries of the game, where the ultimate rule was never change anything?
Yeah.
And so I just love that you have held up. So I like books about artists. I like books about stories about people who are creating some fictional piece of art. I think that's fascinating. But that here it's not just that Leo's essentially a DM, right? And she's really good at like constructing sessions, walking people through them. But that it's not just about constructing this session and having it go really well. That she's really interested in breaking out of the staleness. This thing has gone on too long. It's been recycled too much. We need to move it on. And I find that fascinating because I see so much of that tension in all of the franchise properties and sort of like franchise culture that we have today, right? Where like, I always picking on the Marvel movies, but I think they can take it. The thing that they're circling is they don't know how to end, right? They want to have dramatic endings, but they also want to keep going forever. And it sort of like slowly saps the energy out of everything, even like the quote unquote good entries. And I love that Leo's focus here and sort of her plot over and above all the political stuff going on that she gets wrapped up in is just about how do I end this thing so we can move on to the next thing together.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have any other notes about ending stuff, but I don't know. I really dig that as a theme. The gaming stuff, very fun. I was also thinking about land culture a lot, which is not a thing anymore. But I don't know. Did you do land? Did you do lands at all?
No.
Am I maybe a little too old? Yeah, I was like right at the very tail end of that. I remember that was the thing they would do at my undergrad a little bit for the first couple years, and then the online systems got good enough that people stopped physically carting their computers around to a room to play StarCraft together or whatever.
I guess I was at some of those parties, but I wasn't. I was just like a little bit younger and I didn't actually have the computer to cart along.
Mm-hmm.
And so I always felt like, a little bit sidelined or a little bit stuck, not being able to actually dive into that game.
Yeah, I don't want to glorify that culture too much because there's a lot of weird stuff there. But I was like, one of the things reading this, where again, it's like this book is both anticipating and looking ahead to a lot of interesting things about gaming culture, but it's also visioning something different, and that it still imagines that a very strong social element of like people being in the room together is sort of part of it.
Yeah.
I just found that kind of fascinating and kind of nostalgic in a way that I feel most takes on gaming today would not emphasize that sort of like in the room togetherness kind of thing.
It's true.
This was a fun read. So one of the things to kind of like jump topics entirely, and I don't know that I have anything super clever to say about this. It was something I was noticing was so there are non-human species here, right? At least one.
Right.
Once again, we have to talk about pronunciation. I'm going to say Hesea or just Saya?
I guess I say Saya.
Hesaya. Okay, I'll say Hesaya. Yeah. I should make a point of like getting the audiobook specifically to know these things, or at least how someone else thinks to say it. So the Hesaya are this non-human species. We know like nothing about the larger picture really, except that they are seemingly on roughly equal footing with the main human settlements. I love they use the term the meta governments,
Mhm.
which I think is really fascinating. I don't think I've seen that anywhere else, which is really cool. I just like that because that's a little more nuanced than in like a Star Trek style space opera where it's assumed that there's this sort of like species level hegemony, right? And just like
Right.
you can talk for the humans, you can talk for the Klingons. But here, like we have the Hesaya meta government, and we also have the human meta governments, which I think they mostly call the Republic.
Yeah, and it's important that Burning Bright is not affiliated with either one, that it's somehow an independent political entity.
Yeah, yeah. But I just kind of dug that as a little tiny sort of like I don't know non speciesist non like biological political identity thing. That's a fun little trick. But we have the Hesaya. We barely get a physical description of them. They're roughly humanoid, but we don't get like a ton of details about them.
They have wrist spurs, they have skin that's kind of grayish. We actually learn a lot about their fashion. They're not invested in human ideas of modesty, but they have elaborate signaling systems involving like loops of ribbon that they'll wear around their arms and legs to sort of say, what they're about and how they fit into their own social hierarchy.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating like this book could you could write this book without them, right? Like you could just have another human faction for the most part. But it adds this odd fascinating angle to it and I don't know how deep we'll get into like the whole structure of like fostering and adopting and like granting like honorary Hesaya status to humans and how it has all these different levels. That's like a big like background plot driver to how a lot of these things work, right? Because Ransom used to be not considered a full human by this side, or not a full person, I guess, and now is. So it's changed his criminal status for like previous things, which is fascinating. But anyways, one of the things about the Hesaya that I was just thinking about, I don't know quite what to say about this, is how they fit into a lot of science fiction from this time. They feel Orientalist, they feel
Yeah.
to some extent like a sort of strange, fantastic lens on Japanese or Chinese culture. Obviously, there's a ton of various kinds of weird Oriental takes kind of running throughout cyberpunk. And, they represent this powerful foreign. I don't want to, they're not an enemy, but a powerful foreign player, right, in politics and commerce who are kind of strange and can't totally be understood. I don't have much to say about that, but a lot of the coding of them with the dress, with the tea, with how the rooms are set up, with sort of the formal things, they feel like very. They reminded me a lot about how some of the other cyberpunks kind of cartoonishly think about Japanese American relations in this time.
Yeah, so I think there is definitely that layer, the sort of fascination with and concern about economic dominance that you see in a lot of cyberpunk. And this is also something that you see picked up in C.J. Cherryh's Foreigner books. I think there's some of the same kind of styling and some of the same questions about how you can communicate across a really alien culture. The other thing that I really notice about the Saya world building is that actually a lot of it is ancient Rome. If you're asking about, they have this elaborate patronage structure, and somebody can be essentially enslaved and then become a free person who now has a complicated patron-client relation with the figure who has freed them. All of that is straight out of ancient Rome, I think. And so what you've got is something, it feels a bit to me, and I think this may be direct influence, the way you get multiple cultures layered into Arkady Martine's books, where, Martine has both the Aztec and the Byzantine substructure. Here we have maybe a sort of imperial Japan and also an imperial Rome structure.
No, that totally tracks. That totally makes sense. And that's another the patronage system here is one of those other pieces where it takes a long time for I think the level of the stakes to become really clear.
Yeah.
Which structurally is just really fascinating to me. There's this point, this really distinct point about maybe, I don't know, maybe like 2/3 of the way through this, where all of a sudden all of this maneuvering kind of came clear to me. Well, one of the things, it might actually even be later than that, is when Damien Crestel, who is, I guess you could say is kind of one of the primary antagonists, although it's not clear that he is an antagonist for a while.
Yeah, he's very charming. He's a politician, or I guess he's a businessman who wants to make it as a politician.
And there's this point where it's so for like a big chunk of the book, you're sort of like you get the impression that this one, the visiting speaker, right, Jianbao, one of the Hesaya, is a jerk, is not very nice. You're like, okay, that person's not great, but otherwise, it's just a lot of these people maneuvering, and you don't quite know how to morally code what they're doing,
Right.
right? So I didn't have a strong sense of like Damien's the quote unquote bad guy through most of the book. I know that he's sort of opposed to some of the other people we're following. But then there's this point, again, like 2/3, maybe 3/4 through the book, where all of a sudden you realize, like, oh, he will casually get someone murdered
Yeah.
to further his political ends. And you've also, by that point, learned that Ransom's, like, relationship with Hisaya could very easily wind up with him getting, like, thrown in prison on another planet for the rest of his life. And so it suddenly, like, changes the stakes. It's felt like this sort of it's felt like just like this game, just pieces moving around on the board, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, like people will die depending on how this turns out, and they do in fact. But just it was one of those things where it was such a slow burn, and then suddenly you get this realization about these characters, and it really makes the back end of the book really move quick.
Yeah, and I mean, like the first time you meet Damien Crestel, he's tipping the guy that he slept with the previous night off of his boat that
Yes.
he is living on. And it's just completely played for laughs.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I guess in the book, looping back and looping back, is you keep sort of recontextualizing how he is a person who would do that kind of thing.
I kind of love. So there's that writing advice that you shouldn't give your main characters names that start with the same letters. And it took me big because we've got Crestel, which is starts with CH, Trestle, and you've got Chauvelin, and then you've got Ransom, who is also called IJ, which I think is a shortening of his first name,
Mhm.
and then you've got the Hisaya G Imba, which is JI. So you've got IJ and JI, and you've got two CH names. And I'm not saying it's a mistake. I actually kind of dig it. It just like warning to people picking this up for the first time. You want to track names early on.
Yeah, and I think Crestel and Chauvelin are like deliberately opposed. It's like you're supposed to see them as like two opposite sides in this political game that they've got going.
Yeah, 100%. And the book, structurally and stylistically, something I was noticing was so it starts off very strongly just having one viewpoint character per chapter. But then as it goes on, it actually starts shifting a little bit. So it'll look like a chapter is all on one character, but then you get to a party or something and someone else is there, and the viewpoint will just shift kind of seamlessly over to someone else who's there at the party.
Yeah.
It's not like intense head hopping. It doesn't like go back and forth a lot, but it plays around a lot with like, oh, I think I'm going to get all this character's perspective for this chapter, but then it'll actually like wind up shifting somewhere else and you don't totally know what they're up to, which I thought was an interesting trick.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about AIDS?
Yeah, tell me because I was thinking about that a lot through this. So tell me your thoughts on it.
Yeah. So Ransom, who we've already talked about a bunch, is dying of a nasty chronic disease. We see that he's dependent on an inhaler that helps alleviate his symptoms, but isn't going to cure it. It is no cure. And the particular way that he is slowly dying is pretty clearly an AIDS metaphor, which I guess is made more obvious if you know that Melissa Scott lost a partner who, what, a serious, should have been a life partner to AIDS.
Yeah, I mean, that colors all of the both the artistic and the sort of like interpersonal plot lines throughout this. Particularly, I was saying just a lot how much it really, I don't know how to say this. It seems like it's very carefully sort of like drawing this circle around specifically the loss of artists and artistry, like ahead of their time.
Yeah.
Ransom is this character who we know was like this like very famous, influential gamer and game designer, and has become this visual artist who the book doesn't really go like deep or long on it, but it's really clear he's incredibly talented. And the images that he makes, yeah, stand in for things the book is doing as a whole, like with the looping, with these images of people shifting into different things.
Yeah, there's also, he makes at one point a handful of stones that are faces that have different expressions. And then there's actually an entire just like garden that's paved with these stones of different faces. And that question of how you never really know what's looking at you is another kind
Uh
of
huh.
theme it's running through.
And I think specifically when I think Damien notices it at the party and is sort of like made very uncomfortable by it, and it's like, oh, like yeah,
Yeah,
there are all these people you're walking on, right?
right.
But yeah, the way that Ransom, who we should also say that this book, we could talk an entire episode about the sexuality in this book, right? And I don't know if it's an assumed bisexuality or ambisexuality or pansexuality throughout the book, but it's never really questioned. Ransom sleeps with both of the sort of like antagonizing forces, right? Like he's Chauvelin's like longtime lover, and he does wind up sleeping with Damien as well.
Right. And Chauvelin is a little bit jealous of Ransom's interest in Quinn Leo. Like
Yeah.
there's a little bit of sexual jealousy there.
Yep. Having this character who is threaded artistically and politically and romantically throughout all these different lives, suffering through the entire book with this idea that like this is an incurable thing, that it's going to take away this person too soon. I think Leo specifically has the thought at one point that like he should be around for another 30 or 40 years. And it's like this incredible tragedy that it's not going to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, feels like the book is thinking through and processing what was lost with AIDS.
Do you want to talk about the puzzle of the very end interlude game sequence? Because there's something that confused me about it for a long, long time, but it is like a major spoiler.
Oh yeah, no, we can spoil this. Go ahead. Tell us about the puzzle.
So we see this frame story. It's the game that they're playing, people trying to get off of Ixian's wheel, and we have different players who are inhabiting different roles as we're trying to figure out sort of how can we have the best possible escape from Ixian's wheel. And at the very end of the book, there's this final episode where they're escaping Ixian's wheel and they do it, they get it right. They're able to set up this rebellion that will go forward and like reshape the entire empire within this game. And one of the players is Ransom, and that's impossible because Ransom is dead. Yeah, so as a kid, this just like I kept being like, is this real? Is this a typo? What's going
Mm-hmm.
on? Is that Glot Calf's Ransom? And I was like, sort of flip back and forth and be like, no, no, he's really dead. How, what, why? I did have the advantage with higher technology that, I checked the ebook version and no, really, it's Ransom. Like,
And we should say too that like stylistically the way this is conveyed, so we get these little interlude chapters that are set totally within the in-world fiction of the game.
mhm.
But when we first meet the characters there, they're named with their in-world character name, and then it's like slash, and then in all caps, the person in the outside that fictional world who is playing them.
Right. It's almost like a movie script kind of styling.
And what we get in that last one is is it Avalar? Is that the character?
Yeah.
Yeah, Avalar slash all caps ambidexter, which is Ransom's playing name.
Right.
But it doesn't say Ransom, it says ambidexter, but that's always what he played under.
Right. And like it's very clear that he was very possessive, right? Like it would have been, I think, a huge scandal if anyone else had pretended to be ambidexter.
So how do you read the puzzle?
So the way I read the puzzle is that this is the outcome that Quinn Leo sees as possible and is working towards. And a lot of it is in the interaction between Royal Evelar, who is telepathic, and we learn in the course of these vignettes that he can sort of draw on the powers of other telepaths and rechannel them. So it's the interaction between Evelar and a particular telepath, Jack Blue, who is played here by Quinn's sort of like maybe new lover, Rasha. Essentially, Jack Blue makes a willing sacrifice to let the rebellion go forward. So I think this is sort of like the ideal. Like we know that if Ambidexter had been able to play Royal, it could have gone through like absolutely cleanly in this exact way. But then, of course, it doesn't actually hit. It doesn't actually change the game if only Ambidexter can pull it off, right?
Mm.
Like, she actually needs everyone to see this happen, to play their own versions, and to sort of carry forward their own echoes of how this could be and be the story going forward. And so, although this is like, the ideal and the most perfect, it can't be only the one person who makes it work. There have to be like many, many ways to make it work to actually carry that story.
That's good. No, I like that. And I love well, two things that I really like about it is one, that in a book that very much seems on many levels about just individuals striving, right? And this sort of like how much like selfishness and people like pursuing their own political or material gain is driving so much of it. And you have a lot of these characters who feel very isolated, right? Like Ransom and Quinn are both not stereotypes, but kind of like archetypes of like the lone artist, right?
Right.
And then the solution that can finally quote unquote end the game and take it to the next level is getting a character who literally cannot do it alone.
Yeah.
And like making that the sort of the keystone for the whole project, which I really dig. And the other thing I just dig throughout the novel, and it doesn't the narrative gaze never focuses on this too much, but the way that all of the games that they're playing are not a one-off, right? That like when Quinn first gets to Burning Bright and like runs her first game and it's like, goes really well and it's really popular, gets a lot of attention, that like the next day people are playing that session again and she's kind of like
Yeah.
glancing in, through the nets. Like, oh, people are playing that already. Like, and this idea of, I think that goes back to the idea of like looping and like rehearsing.
Right.
And I think maybe this is maybe me reaching a little too much, but like thinking a little bit about like what we're doing with narrative more generally and art more generally, right? Is like providing these templates for people to think through and kind of play through on their own.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Why don't we? This is a good place to take a quick break. I'm gonna grab a drink of water and see if I can chill my dog out, and then I will be right back. All right, we are back. We are still talking about Melissa Scott's novel, Burning Bright. And we want to talk a little bit about potential influence this has had on other works, or at least resonance with work that's come after. And we might jump backwards in time too, and talk about things that this might be in conversation with. But Ursula, in the break, you were talking a little bit about A Memory Called Empire and A Desolation Called Peace and this book. Tell me what the connections are that you're pulling between those.
Right. So I have seen Arkady Martine talking about how she imprinted deeply on this book. And as someone who also imprinted deeply on this book, like I was really interested in that. And I was particularly interested in the fact that Arkady and I did not imprint on the same characters. For Arkady, it was very much a fascination with Ransom and with Chauvelin and with the idea of the ambassador. And I think maybe also the romance of the tragic figure. I think that sort of like incredibly compelling, incredibly charming political figure who also is maybe like dead at some point during the course of the book is something that you can see reflected pretty clearly in Memory Called Empire. Whereas for me, the fascination was really with Leo and Rasha and this relationship that's like maybe completely not serious or maybe matters a bit more, and the sort of bread and butter trying to make a living questions.
No, that's really good. I dig that second thing that you're interested in too. I really dug that as a counterpoint. It has this because yeah, you have these sort of like capital H high relationships, right? Of like these like tragic, politically invested, decades old history things going on with Chauvelin and Ransom, and then
And
you
beautiful
have
and glittering and all of
yeah,
the art. Yeah,
yeah, right. And then you have Rasha and Quinn hook up on a boat,
right.
and then are like, oh, maybe this is more. I'm not sure. And then like, yeah, and it has all those practical things about like bus passes and like when the political things do start kicking off, like Quinn being really seriously like, why would Rasha lose her job over this thing, right? Like, this is like, and her job is like a dock worker, right?
Right.
So yeah, I do like that it has those two very different class levels going on. I hadn't until you put it that way. Now that you say that, I'm like, oh yes, A Memory Called Empire has some strong resonance with this. I totally see that. I also like that to me is drawing sort of like a triangle between those two and between Cherry's Foreigner, which you already mentioned,
Yeah.
which in some ways feels like an inversion of this book, or this book as an inversion of that in terms of like how the power structures and even the narrative structure works, right? Where I'm thinking of Bren in Foreigner and the visiting speaker here, the Saya visiting speaker, as sort of like opposite structures in terms of both their personalities and their power and how everything still sort of like circles around them and what they can do or can't do.
Yeah.
When I was digging through my notes here, and I said this in the break, but I'll say it again, I was trying to figure out how to put this sort of in conversation with some of the other early stuff about about gaming and virtual reality.
Mhm.
And I'm not totally sure what to say about it. I really like this one, and this one feels it's both slightly outdated enough that it feels fun, like the net walking, and how much this book is thinking about what today we would just call the internet. It's thinking about virtual spaces, and like they're around a little bit, right? By the time this book is written, like they're around more than like when famously like Gibson coins the word cyberspace on a manual typewriter, right? Because it's like a
Right.
little bit before, but this book still has a strongly spatial and visual idea of what that's going to look like as it develops in a way that by and large it hasn't in reality like had like a strong visual spatial component to how we like go online, right?
Right. Like none of us really want to be in the metaverse.
Right, exactly. And like attempts to do that have famously like failed kind of catastrophically. But it makes for much more fun reading, and like the imagery is really interesting and I dig that. So I was thinking about that a bit, and I was trying to find a way to put this in conversation with Banks' Player of Games, which feels like this big giant thing, right, about gaming and science fiction and space opera. And I think they're just talking about two totally different things. I can't quite, maybe if I sat down and thought about it some more, I could find a way to put them more on the same level. But I feel like the games in Banks' book, they're basically just mega chess, not even like hyper chess. They're just mega chess. They're like what if chess, but way more chess.
Uh-huh.
This book is 100% not interested in that kind of gaming. And it's also not like the gaming in something like Snow Crash, where it's this sort of like, shoot 'em up or, who can use their virtual sword better, right? Like
Right.
this is about role playing and acting and like what are you doing with the character? What are your intentions and motivations? How well can you match the possibilities inherent in the setting? It's just a very, very, very different sense of what gaming is.
I wonder if maybe what we should be holding it up next to is Cameron Reed's Fortunate Fall.
That just came out again. That's been on my list to come back to.
Yeah, I don't think that I got to it in the 90s, so it was a first read to me in the reissue.
Say more.
Yeah, so Fortunate Fall is a classic of queer literature. the protagonist is someone who is she's called a camera, so she's able to record her experiences and then share them with a network of people who are experiencing the same things that she is. Fortunate Falls shares with Scott more generally, I think, questions about the sort of physicality of putting yourself into the internet. This is something that you see maybe more in Trouble and Her Friends, but like the way that you might have augmentations and they might be weird and they might sort of like set you away or apart from other society in ways that have resonances with queer identity. And then also this question of sharing your experience with the world and the audience and the way that because of the internet, however we perceive it, it's like magnifying the emotional reaction of the audience to whatever you're doing and whatever you're trying to do and how you navigate it. That seems like something that plays against Burning Bright to me.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I was reading this and thinking about the very, very 90s, very like kind of like hackers kind of feeling of like, glittering lines in space, as like what the internet is. And trying to think about what is the science fiction today that feels like it's engaging with whatever the heck the internet is. And I was not coming up with any great examples off the top of my head, but just thinking about the way this does a great job of thinking about that like private public split and thinking about performance. This has a lot of really interesting angles about that.
Yeah. I mean, so I've argued before that one of the things that cyberpunk really leverages is the idea that you have two worlds. You have sort of like the online world and the offline world, and you get a lot of narrative power from sort of like translating between one and the other, kind of flipping back and forth, seeing where the interface is or doesn't. And that it's hard to write that same kind of story now just because like the distinction isn't there, right?
Mm.
Like there's no difference between like on my phone and off my phone that's like, a really strong cut from like kind of one story space to another. It's just like, did I pick it up or put it down?
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, in Gibson's Blue Ant trilogy, which are not really science fiction, if you want to get really technical about it, he's got that whole thing about the internet averting, right? That it was something that was inside, and now it's like flipping and going outside. It's just everywhere out in the world now.
Yeah.
And there are other people who have run with that too. I want to say I can't think of this story now. I think Charlie Jane Anders has a story that plays around with that. This was a cool read. So this was my first time reading it. I don't know that I would have got to it if you hadn't suggested it. Trouble and Her Friends, I think, is the sort of like big early Scott that will probably like stay kind of like the one people think about and talk about. And I know a couple people who are really big fans of her Astrayant series, so I'm sure I'm going to get to those eventually. But this one, I don't know if I would have come to if you hadn't spotlighted it. So thank you. This was a fun read. This was really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love this one. I love all the different things it does with genres and sort of like the way it sets different kinds of story next to each other.
I want to come back to this more in like my more like readerly writerly hat on and just think about the style here. There's something going on with just like the sentence structure and how the imagery works that it's really good. And it also feels like a really good example of like a certain period and style. Like this doesn't remind me of any individual Bruce Sterling novel, but I was thinking about Sterling a little bit. I was thinking a lot about Michael Swanwick's Stations of the Tide and a bunch of other like late 80s, early 90s, like sort of like more literary bent cyberpunk adjacent stuff. It's just doing some really smart stuff, and the imagery really sticks with me. We didn't really talk about this world at all, but like that it's on this almost entirely ocean world that has this little tiny, like island canal Venice-y thing that's been built, and just had tons of these images that really jumped out at me. The parade with like the giant animatronic figures on it. Yeah, just lots of really cool stuff.
Yeah. And the masks as well. There's this whole long sequence like bargaining for a mask and trying to figure out like, do you want to fit in with the carnival or is that not your thing?
Yeah, that's, we're wrapping this up, but back to that, like, that idea of it having like really distinct class levels and having this sort of like more like high rarefied political game, but then also this sort of street level thing. I love how many of just like the people you bump into have names and characters and like feel like real people just like on their little boat selling their masks or whatever. Like, I dig that.
Yeah.
Before we get going, do you want to share anything else that you're working on or have coming out or where people can find you?
So you can find me on my website, which is yarntheory.net, which has links to sort of all the standard places. I'm around on Blue Sky a lot. So yarntheory.bsky or however they handle it is a great place to find me. I do have a poem out in the latest issue of Asimov's. So if you can find that or if you want to subscribe to Asimov's, I really enjoy poetry there. Otherwise, check out my book, North Continent Ribbon, and stay tuned for more things.
Awesome. That's very cool. Also, I want to say when I was double checking your bio before I did this episode, I realized I should have done that ages ago because in one of the ancillary discords, we had a long discussion about what formally to call North Continent Ribbon because it came from Neon Hemlock, who does the novella packs,
Right.
but it is also a collection. And so we had this long running discussion about it. And then like I went to your website and like line 2 of your website is like my mosaic novel. And I was like, oh, it's a mosaic novel. It's solved. All right. Rosanna Pendlebury, I'm sure you're listening. You were right.
Well, I mean, to tell you the truth, I wrote that text and then my editor sent me this like melting face emoji because this is something that we've been doing like behind
Okay.
the scenes as well. I think we initially thought of it as a story collection, but then it is a story collection that has an arc and it is just lengthwise, slightly maybe creeping into being a very short novel.
We got into this whole discussion of like, does it make sense to say mosaic novella? Is that even a thing that makes sense to say? Because it feels like somehow the mosaic modifier. Anyways, great collection. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for coming and talking about this book. Thank you for making me read it. This was really fun.
Thanks, it was great.
A Meal at Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Barsha Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabrielle Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. Thanks to our human transcribers, Kate Dollarhyde and John W.M. Thompson. They are diligently working on getting us caught up on our transcriptions. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is rad. A few different ways you can do that. Join our Patreon. A couple dollars a month really moves us towards our sustainability and contributor paying goals. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a couple other goodies in the works. If you're interested in a book we mention, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut, and it helps us immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving us a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can follow us on Blue Sky for periodic skeets, I guess. Next time, author Timothy Moore is joining me to talk about Donald Barthelme's collection, 60 Stories. As I record this, I'm realizing that I meant to share a list of the stories we're focusing on, so you don't have to read all 60 if you don't feel like it. I will put those on the website, where you can also see the next several books if you want to read ahead. Until then, read well, stay critical out there.